Assumption can be a very powerful tool in moving your prospect further down the sales process. One of the mistakes that I made early in my sales career was continually asking my prospect for permission. I was so cautious and careful that I didn't want to bully them or offend them, that I always asked for permission. Like I was too cautious not to be a pushy sales guy. And so I was reluctant to lead them through the process. First, as the sales professional, you are the expert, and it's your role to lead them through the sales process. You're there to solve their problem. And this is one thing I learned. If they were uncomfortable, they would put on the brakes. So they would say, hey, let's slow this down. So I'm going to give some examples. Again, they're in reference to car sales, but I'm sure you can make the connection within your own industry. See, I was doing lots of vehicle demos, but there was a disproportionate amount of test drives to the demonstrations I was doing. And I started to sell more vehicles when I had more people test drive. So how did I get them to do a test drive? I just assumed that they would. I stopped asking them and I just assumed that they would go for a drive, because logically that was the next step in the sales process. So initially I would ask them, like, do you want to go for a drive? Or, so do you guys have time for a drive right now? I would actually open the door for a potential out for each of the prospects. I would give them an option to say no. And when I shifted, all I did was just assume that they would test drive, because after all, they're at a car dealership and they wanted to buy a vehicle. So why wouldn't they test drive? And then guess what they did? They actually went for a drive. So I would say something like, okay, all I need to do now is just get a copy of your license, grab a plate, and let's go for a drive. Sound fair enough? It was miraculous. They would just dig into their pocket, pull out their wallet, and hand me their license. And if I was dealing with a couple, they would look at each other and then discuss who was going to drive. The question didn't become about if they were going to drive, but who was going to drive. So I just started to assume that every driver was going to drive. And most of them did. And another example with the assumption was regarding the deposit. So if I asked them if they wanted to leave a deposit, they not all the time did. And we started a discussion about deposits. But when I started to assume that they would leave a deposit, it was a game changer. Why? Because I just started to assume that they were going to buy the vehicle. Why? Because they hadn't told me they weren't yet. So in order to secure the vehicle, a customer needed to leave a deposit to secure the deal. So I started to change my question. So I didn't ask, do you want to leave a deposit? I started asking, so how would you like to leave a deposit? On MasterCard or Visa? And here's the one thing I learned. If they were ready to make the next move, they would just pull out their wallet and give me the card. Again, the discussion wasn't were they going to leave a deposit, it was how they were going to leave a deposit. If they weren't ready for a deposit, if they weren't ready for a test drive, they would stop me. They would put on the brakes. They would say, whoa, we're not going for a test drive, or there's no way we're leaving a deposit. And then they would just state their objection. And what I learned was to welcome the following objection, because once they gave the objection, I now knew what was standing in the way of them saying yes to a deal. You see, my prospect had taken time out of their day. They had come to a car dealership. They'd answered all my investigation questions. I'd asked them what they're looking for. We'd gone through a lot of personal information about their situation, even about their finances. I've now shown them a vehicle. I've maybe even looked at their trade. And they were still there. So chances are, if they were still there, they had an intention to buy a vehicle. So I just started to assume that that's what they were going to do. However, one of the things that needed to shift in me in order to make this assumption was I started to overcome my fear of their objection, because my assumption would lead to exposing their objections. And as I started to reframe the objection as a necessary part of the sales process, I began to become more confident in my assumption to continue to move forward, Move them further through the sales process. You see, your prospect has taken time out of their day to engage you to talk about their problem and to hear your solution. So why not assume that they're going to continue to close the deal? And if they're not ready, they'll put on the brakes. If they're uncertain, they'll slow the process down. So I encourage you, take a look at your sales process and examine where you could, where you right now are opening the door of escape for your prospects, rather than building a bridge so that you can move them forward to the next step of the process through assuming that they're just going to take that next step.